All right, hello. Well, now that we've learned some skull bones, let's take a look at some of the features of bone, some of these landmarks in regards to bones. And some of these will be places where the bones kind of stick out or make some other kind of a shape. And in a separate video, I will talk about the openings. All right, so what I'm going to zero in on is a lot of this cool stuff in regards to the temporal bone. And you probably are noticing this thing right away. Now, the first skull that I used didn't have this. It was broken off, and you will see that with our collection. And it's not surprising that this is something that often breaks off. I'm not saying in life, but in just in the storage of these skulls, and over the years, we've had these skulls. I don't know how long, but probably they were around in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and I think this is a more recent one. So it had less chance to be broken. So anyway, this is the styloid process of the mandible. All right, you can see other cool things that we'll be talking about in regards to the mandible. This thing that's right nearby is another part, I don't mean mandible, of the temporal. So this structure right here is another part of the temporal, and that's the mastoid. So you can see this mastoid of hanging down. It's something that I talk a little bit about when I talk about the sex differences, and the mastoid process is a little bit different. We'll learn this whole in another video, but it's external auditory meatus. There that is. And another part of this cool temporal bone is this. And take you pretty close to it. And you see that there's this ditchy part in the bone here. And then also a bit of a roundedness right here. And I'll show it to you on the other side as well. And this is involved with the jaw joint, of course. And I've already introduced you to the condyloid process, but I'll get a mandible right now. And this is the condyloid process, and so it would fit in right there. And that's a part of what's called the temporomandibular joint. I guess I'll make it more upright like this, so it would be fitting in like this. And this ditchy part is called the fossa, the mandibular fossa. Whenever there's a little ditchy part in bone, sometimes it's for muscle, but that's not the case here. It's actually so that there's a little ditchy part that can accept the condylar process of the mandible. And so you can imagine your jaw just joint kind of working like this with the condylar process in the mandibular fossa. But another part of the joint is right nearby. This is called the articular tubercle. And interestingly, when you open your mouth pretty big, I'll show you like this, the condylar process moves to the articular tubercle. There is this roundedness to it. So it's in here, but it's also out here quite a bit as well. And we'll talk about that in more detail in lecture when we talk about the temporomandibular joint. Okay, but then for one last part of the temporal bone, and this is one we actually already did in another previous video, but just to remind you, this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. It makes that posterior part of the zygomatic arch. All right, let's take a look at some structures that are on the underside of the skull. There's the styloid process again. It's just kind of wonky out there. Not surprisingly, there are some muscles that attach to that. We'll even mention them a little bit in lecture, like when I get to respiration and so on, in the tongue. Anyway, do you see this? These nice rounded parts of the occipital. And so these are called, maybe not surprisingly at this point, occipital condyles. It is a condylar surface. It is a kind of nice, smooth surface that is a part of a joint. And this is where the very top vertebra, it's called the atlas, but that's for another day, that articulates there with the occipital condyle. All right, so occipital condyle is there. Then let's take a look at some other kinds of parts of the skull. It looks kind of all complicated all around here. Now we know that this is the vomer. Now in this skull it's partially broken off, the vomer. But just lateral to the vomer, you can see these kind of wall-like parts of bone. These are called pterygoid processes, or a pterygoid plate. And they get called medial and lateral, and you can kind of maybe guess how you would name these by taking a look at them right now. So this one and this one are both medial pterygoid processes / plates. They're medial. And then these are the lateral pterygoid processes / plates. And they are a part of the sphenoid. So that sphenoid bone that we had shown in another video, here's some parts of them. So the sphenoid can get to be a little bit of a complicated shape. All right, you know, right nearby, I'll just mention again this. This is called the hard palate, and it's made of maxilla and palatine. In this skull, the suture between the palatine and the maxilla is not as obvious, but on a practical, we would try to use good examples where you can really see. You know, if you look really close, you can see the suture anyway. All right, so hard palate. And another structure I want to talk about is called the Nuchal Line. And that's in reference to a raised area along the occipital, and it's where some ligaments and even muscles attach that come from the neck. And so now the Nuchal Line is not very obvious on the skull. When I do the videos on the sex, this is a male, and Nuchal lines are more prominent on males. This you can see this kind of bump there that's coming off of the occipital. However, I am going to show you, I happen to have this more distinctive looking Nuchal line on this male. This is an older male, and I don't know, maybe he had a robust neck. Impressive. So this is the Nuchal line. But if you look at a female skull, they won't have much of a Nuchal line at all. And so it ends up being a structure that's a little bit different from skull to skull. Hello again. So I'm going to finish up by taking a look at some of the features that you can see on the interior of the skull, some of these openings. And I guess I'll start with this. Turn the skull like this. This is where the internal auditory meatus is. And this is associated with the ear, and this is where the vestibular cochlear nerve, one of the cranial nerves, would be arising out of. And so you have the external auditory meatus that would eventually, kind of where my probe is going up into, would be headed towards where the middle ear is. This is external ear. headed towards the middle ear, we'd have a tympanum, and so that's all that would be going on inside here is where the middle ear is, and then we'd have the nerves bringing that sensory information to the brain arising through here. So this internal auditory meatus, yay. Then this very obvious opening here, the foramen lacerum. And remember when we talked about the carotid canal, the carotid enters in through the carotid canal, kind of shifts through the canal and arises out of this opening. And, oh yeah, the jugular, you can see the jugular foramen is here. Now, might also just find of interest that there is this interesting kind of ditchy portion of the sphenoid bone, and a portion of the brain kind of sits in there. If you've learned about brain anatomy, you might guess kind of what might be dangling down there off of the bottom of the brain. It's the pituitary. So the pituitary kind of sits around in there. There's a lot of vascularization there. We will be talking about the pituitary eventually, but here we are just looking at skull features, and we've covered everything. Oh, wait a minute. No, I was about to wrap things up, and I saw another hole. Here, the other side of the optic canal. So here and here, you can kind of confirm. You can kind of poke it in and then see, well, where does it end up? And it's there. It's coming out, that optic canal. So that's where the optic nerve comes into. It's always good to look at some variety, and so since I have this other skull, I thought I'd also take a look at some of the openings that you can see. So this is that large male skull, that's the carotid canal, jugular, foramen lacerum. Well, that's mainly it. And I'll also take a look on the interior in just a sec. Okay, and here's the interior of that male skull, and some of those openings. There's the foramen lacerum, the internal auditory meatus, jugular is here, optic is here. Where's his orbit? There it is. All right. Okay, so there's an overview of all these features of the skull.